Ethan Carter had always prided himself on his independence. Raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for him, he had learned early on that nothing in life came easy. But his circumstances had a way of testing that pride at every turn. At 24, he was deep in the throes of his final year of engineering school, balancing long hours of lectures, grueling study sessions, and part-time jobs that barely kept him afloat. Yet, despite his hard work, the burden of his father's unpaid debts loomed like an insurmountable mountain on his shoulders. His father, a man Ethan barely knew, had left nothing behind but bills, empty promises, and a legacy of financial ruin. The weight of his death was not a loss in the emotional sense. Ethan had long since come to terms with the fact that he didn't know the man, nor had the man ever been a part of his life. But the debts left behind were another story. His mother, ever the optimist despite her chronic illness, had done her best to shield him from the reality of their situation. But the hospital bills were piling up, and his younger sister's education fees added another layer of stress. The costs of surviving in this world, it seemed, were crushing them all. Every day was a battle. Ethan couldn't recall a single moment. In the past year, when he didn't feel the suffocating pressure of deadlines, unpaid bills, and the future that seemed ever so distant, yet always just out of reach, his phone buzzed constantly with notifications from loan agencies, reminders of unpaid dues, and messages from his mother asking about his progress in finding a solution. It wasn't that Ethan wasn't trying. He was, and fiercely. But despite his best efforts, the hole seemed to grow deeper, not shallower. It was late one evening when Ethan's world, already heavy with uncertainty, was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. He had just returned to his small apartment after an exhausting shift at the local cafe and collapsed into the worn-out chair in his living room. The apartment was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. When his phone buzzed, he didn't expect much. Another bill reminder, another loan collector. But the name that flashed across the screen was unfamiliar, and his curiosity overruled the exhaustion he felt. "Hello, this is Ethan Carter," he answered, his voice strained from the weight of his day. A cool, measured voice came through the receiver. "Mr. Carter, my name is Sylvia Weston. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. How could this woman possibly know about his finances? He didn't even know how to explain it to anyone, least of all a stranger. "I'm sorry, but how do you know about my situation?" he asked, confusion and suspicion beginning to creep in. "I know enough," the voice on the other end answered, smoothly, with a confidence that left no room for hesitation. "Let's meet tomorrow at the Blue Oak Cafe, 7 p.m. It's urgent." Before Ethan could ask anything more, the line went dead. His phone buzzed in his hand, the screen now black, leaving him with an unsettling sense of foreboding. Who was this woman, and why was she reaching out to him now? He was no stranger to the idea of charity or assistance, but something about her calm tone, the sheer certainty in her voice, made him uneasy. The following evening, under a sky that had begun to darken with the promise of rain, Ethan found himself standing outside the Blue Oak Cafe. The place was cozy, a familiar spot for him when he needed a break from the chaos of life. But tonight, it felt different. The sound of his boots on the wet pavement echoed in the quiet street as he pushed open the door. A wave of warmth hit him, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in his bones. In the far corner sat Sylvia Weston. She was an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, but there was a sharpness about her that belied her years. Her silver hair was styled to perfection, her tailored coat accentuating her commanding presence. She was seated at a table, her green eyes scanning a document as if she were in complete control of everything around her. There was an aura of wealth and power that radiated from her, something Ethan had only seen in fleeting glimpses in movies or the society pages of newspapers. "Mr. Carter," she greeted him, her voice a mixture of warmth and authority. "Please, sit." He hesitated, still unsure of what to expect, but he did as she asked, pulling out the chair across from her. His mind raced as he took in her composed demeanor. Was this some sort of charity meeting? A business proposal? The uncertainty gnawed at him. She set down the papers with an almost deliberate slowness, her gaze never leaving his. "I know about your situation, Ethan," she began. "The debts your father left behind, the bills that are piling up, the stress you're under. You're drowning, aren't you?" Ethan felt a pang of frustration, mixed with embarrassment. He nodded, unable to speak as she continued. "I'm offering you a solution," she said, her tone softening just enough to make him think she wasn't entirely a stranger. "I will pay off all your debts, every single one, your mother's medical bills, your tuition fees, everything. In exchange, you'll marry me." Ethan blinked, the words not registering at first. "What?" he finally managed to ask, disbelieving. Sylvia's eyes were steady, unwavering. "It's simple, really. You marry me, and I ensure your financial future. You will have no more worries. Your family will have everything they need. This is not about love or romance. It's a business arrangement." The room seemed to close in around him. He was shocked, stunned by the sheer audacity of the offer. Marry her. A woman almost twice his age, a stranger to him, with nothing in common except a desperate need to escape his circumstances. The thought seemed absurd. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sylvia paused for a moment, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Because you are young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider it. I've spent years alone. I have no children, no heirs. I need a companion, someone to stand beside me and ensure my legacy. You need money. We both get what we need. Ethan." Sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He wasn't sure what to feel. Part of him wanted to laugh at how preposterous it all seemed, but another part of him, the part that had seen his mother struggle and felt the weight of his debts, knew that this offer could be his only way out. Sylvia's voice broke through his thoughts. "I understand if you need time, but don't take too long. The offer will expire." As Ethan walked back to his apartment that night, the rain fell harder, soaking him to the bone. But it wasn't just the rain that weighed heavily on him. It was the impossible choice before him. Could he really marry a woman he didn't know for money? Could he give up his autonomy, his dreams, his dignity, just to survive? His thoughts were a storm of their own as he lay awake that night, his mind racing. He didn't have a clear answer, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change forever, whether he was ready for it or not. The weight of Sylvia Weston's offer lingered in Ethan Carter's mind long after their meeting ended. The next few hours felt like an eternity as he sat in the dim light of his apartment, his thoughts consumed by the surreal proposition that had been placed before him. Marry a woman he barely knew, who was almost twice his age, and in return, he would be freed from the crushing debts that had haunted him for years. His life, and the lives of his mother and sister, would be secure, and he would no longer have to fear the inevitable call from creditors or the mounting bills that seemed to multiply each day. It sounded like an impossible dream, but there was a cold, logical side to it that tugged at him, making him wonder if it was the only way forward. Ethan had never been one to shy away from hard work or sacrifice. Raised by his mother, who had done everything in her power to make ends meet, he had learned to value perseverance. His father, who had been absent for most of his life, left behind nothing but financial ruin and a legacy of neglect. The wounds of his father's abandonment still stung, but it was the financial burden that remained, the inheritance of debts and unpaid bills that had begun to tear apart the fragile fabric of his life. His mother's chronic illness had drained their savings, and the thought of her enduring another round of expensive treatments was more than he could bear. His younger sister, just starting college, had been forced to take on student loans of her own. Each day, the weight of their collective struggles pressed down harder, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The offer from Sylvia, though jarring and unorthodox, seemed like a lifeline. It was the kind of solution that no one would ever dream of, yet the kind that could solve every problem Ethan had, immediately and without question. Sylvia was a wealthy woman with power, connections, and the kind of security that Ethan could only dream of. Her proposition to marry her, in exchange for clearing his debts and securing his family's future, felt like the kind of escape he had been longing for without even realizing it. For the first time in months, he didn't have to worry about the crushing weight of his financial troubles. It was an offer few would turn down, especially when faced with the kind of desperation that Ethan had been living with. But there was something more to the proposition, something that gnawed at him, that made him question the real motive behind it. Sylvia wasn't offering him a fresh start out of kindness or compassion. She was offering him a deal, a business arrangement, a transaction. She didn't care about love or companionship, only about control, and in some ways, that was what unsettled Ethan the most. He had no illusions about his circumstances. He knew he wasn't in a position to be picky, but the very idea that he was being bought, his name, his presence, his future, was something that weighed heavily on his conscience. Could he really trade his dignity for security? Was he so desperate that he would accept any solution, no matter the cost to his soul? Ethan's thoughts were filled with conflicting emotions as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but sleep wouldn't come. The decision seemed too important, too irreversible. Sylvia had made it clear that there would be no turning back once he accepted. The reality of his situation loomed over him like a shadow. The debts he owed were insurmountable, and no matter how hard he worked, they seemed to keep growing, like a beast that could never be satisfied. His mother, who had always been his source of strength, was growing weaker with each passing day. And his sister, who had tried so hard to build a future of her own, was now faced with the heavy burden of debt. Ethan could feel the weight of their expectations pressing on him, the fear of failing them eating away at his insides. Yet there was another side to this, a part of him that resented the offer, that recoiled at the thought of tying his life to someone like Sylvia Weston. She was a woman who had lived her life in luxury, whose every need had been catered to by her wealth and status. What did she know of struggle, of sacrifice, of having to choose between paying for food or medicine? Ethan had spent his whole life trying to build something for himself and his family, not to be bought, not to become someone else's pawn in a game of power. The very idea that his future, his entire life, could be reduced to a transaction left him feeling hollow. Was this the only way out of the trap he had found himself in? But as the days passed, the reality of his situation grew even more pressing. The calls from debt collectors became more frequent, the reminders of overdue bills more insistent. His mother's condition worsened, and the stress of their financial predicament only seemed to exacerbate it. Ethan had tried every angle to find a solution, working multiple jobs, selling whatever he could, borrowing money from friends, but nothing seemed to make a dent in the mountain of debt that his father had left behind. He had reached the end of his rope. He had no other options, no other way out. So, reluctantly, he made his decision. He would go back to Sylvia and accept her offer. He would marry her. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but in his mind, it was the only choice that made sense. The thought of marrying a woman he didn't love, of entering into a relationship that was so clearly transactional, felt like a betrayal of everything he had ever believed in. But he had to be practical. He had to think about his family, his mother's health, his sister's future. They needed him to make this choice, even if it meant sacrificing his own desires, his own dignity. When Ethan returned to the Blue Oak Cafe the next day, Sylvia was already there, waiting. There was no need for pleasantries, no room for second-guessing. He walked in, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision, and sat down across from her. Sylvia looked at him with that same calm, calculating expression she had worn the day before. "You've made your decision," she said, as though she had already known. Ethan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it." Sylvia's lips curled into a faint smile, one that was both knowing and satisfied. She had gotten what she wanted. She always did. But for Ethan, this moment was one of profound surrender, an admission that he had lost the fight before it had even begun. He had sold his future for a chance at stability, a future that now seemed uncertain, no matter how much security Sylvia promised. As they finalized the details, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just sealed his own fate, a fate that had been determined by forces beyond his control. The life he had imagined for himself, the one where he could build something meaningful, had slipped away. Now, he was just another person in Sylvia Weston's carefully constructed world, a pawn in a game of power and survival. The offer had been too tempting, the stakes too high, but as Ethan walked away from the cafe that day, his soul felt heavier than it ever had before. He had made a choice that would change everything, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Ethan Carter's decision to marry Sylvia Weston, though born of necessity, weighed heavily on him as he entered the next phase of his life. The choice, though practical, felt like a sacrifice of everything he had hoped to preserve: his independence, his dignity, his future. The morning after his acceptance, he stood in front of the mirror staring at his reflection, still grappling with the enormity of what he had just agreed to. His life, once filled with the quiet hope of finishing his degree, of making something meaningful of his existence, was now dictated by a woman he barely knew, whose life was as foreign to him as the wealth she wielded. As Ethan made his way to Sylvia's mansion, the enormity of his decision began to settle in. The estate was a fortress of wealth, its towering gates and grand stone columns standing like an impenetrable barrier between him and the life he had known. He was no longer a young man struggling to get by. He had stepped into a new world, a world of power and control, a world where his worth was now measured not by his dreams, but by his ability to fulfill an agreement. Sylvia had already begun to make arrangements for their marriage, and within days he found himself standing in front of a courthouse, dressed in a suit provided by her. The ceremony was short, formal, and devoid of any warmth or sentiment. There were no guests, no laughter, no joy, only a notary, a lawyer, and the cold sound of the officiant's voice pronouncing them husband and wife. The weight of the moment was not lost on Ethan. As the words were spoken, he could feel the last vestiges of his old life slipping away, swallowed by the sheer magnitude of the decision he had made. This was not a union of love or passion. It was a contract, a business transaction, and nothing more. But as Sylvia turned to him, offering him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Ethan realized that this was only the beginning. What had once seemed like an escape, a lifeline from the suffocating weight of his debts, now felt like a trap, a gilded cage from which there was no easy escape. The mansion that awaited him, with its cold, empty halls and towering walls, felt like a prison rather than a sanctuary. He had entered a world of opulence and luxury, but it was a world that came with its own set of rules, its own demands, and its own cost. Sylvia was everything he had imagined, elegant, composed, and cold. Her presence filled the vast rooms of the mansion, but there was no warmth, no comfort. It was as though the house itself had been built to reflect her own sense of isolation, a place that was meant to impress, not to nurture. Ethan's room, though magnificent, felt sterile, untouched by any real sense of human warmth. The antique furniture, the pristine sheets on the bed, the polished floors, all of it spoke of a life spent accumulating things, but nothing that could offer him any real solace. As days passed, Ethan began to feel the weight of his decision more acutely. Sylvia kept her distance, speaking only when necessary, her gaze always distant, as if she were watching him from a place far removed from the present moment. She would pass him in the hallway, her eyes cool and detached, never offering more than the briefest of nods. He had been nothing more than a means to an end for her, a tool to secure her legacy, and now he was left to wander the halls of her mansion, wondering what exactly he had signed up for. But it was in the evenings, as the mansion grew quiet and the shadows stretched long across the walls, that Ethan began to feel the true isolation of his new life. Sylvia was never far away, but she was always an enigma to him. She would sit at the long dining table, cutting into her meal with surgical precision, her gaze never wavering from the task at hand. The staff, who moved silently around him, barely acknowledged his presence as if he were simply another piece of furniture in the house. The food was exquisite, but it tasted like nothing, sterile, empty, as though it were meant to nourish the body but not the soul. Ethan found himself alone in the vastness of the mansion, his thoughts becoming increasingly tangled as he wandered. The hallways at night, the locked doors, the rooms he was never allowed to enter, whispered secrets that he was never meant to know. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, the quiet a constant reminder that, despite the luxury surrounding him, he was more alone than he had ever been in his life.
One evening, as he roamed the halls, he stumbled upon a door that he had not noticed before. It was tucked away at the far end of a long hallway, its handle gleaming in the dim light. It was a door that Sylvia had never mentioned, one that was clearly off limits. His curiosity, always a driving force within him, pushed him to examine it further. He knew it was a mistake, that it wasn't his place to pry, but the desire to understand what lay behind the door was too strong to ignore. Here, reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his chest as he twisted it slowly, the soft click of the lock echoing in the stillness. The door opened to a room that was like no other he had seen in the mansion. It was old, untouched, frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture, the wallpaper was faded, and the air smelled stale, as though the room had been closed off for years. On a table in the center of the room were photographs, old and yellowed, capturing moments from a time long past. Sylvia as a young woman, her late husband Harold Brooks, and another couple Ethan didn't recognize. It was then that he found the stack of papers, legal documents, business contracts, and letters. His heart raced as he began to sift through them, his eyes widening with each page he turned. The letters were damning. They detailed the financial ruin that Sylvia's family had suffered at the hands of his own father. Accusations of fraud, deceit, and betrayal jumped off the page, each one a reminder of the legacy his father had left behind. A legacy that had haunted him for years, but the final document, a marriage license, stopped him cold, his name written, in black ink, stared back at him, alongside Sylvia's. It was dated weeks before their actual wedding. He hadn't known about it. It seemed that Sylvia had planned this all along. His involvement in her life, his marriage to her, was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was part of a much larger, much darker scheme. Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't just a pawn in her game, he was a tool in her vendetta. Sylvia hadn't married him for companionship or security. She had married him to exact revenge on the family who had wronged her. He was a means to an end, nothing more. The shock of this revelation hit him harder than anything else he had faced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. He had unwittingly become part of something far more dangerous, and the consequences of his actions were now beginning to unfold before him. As he stood there holding the documents in his hands, Ethan realized that the life he had imagined, one where he could escape his father's shadow, where he could build a future, was slipping further away. He had sold his soul to secure his family's future, but in doing so, he had become a part of a much darker plan that he could not escape. The walls of the mansion felt even more oppressive now, as if they were closing in on him, trapping him in a world he no longer recognized. Sylvia Weston had given him a way out of his debts, but in doing so, she had led him straight into a web of manipulation, deceit, and revenge. The question now was not whether he could escape his financial troubles, but whether he could escape the trap he had walked into, the trap that Sylvia had so carefully set. Ethan Carter had always been a man of principle, a young man who believed in hard work, independence, and the value of earning one's place in the world. But as he walked through the grand hallways of Sylvia Weston's mansion, the life he had envisioned for himself, the life where he could rise above the suffocating weight of his father's debts and create a future, seemed to slip further and further out of reach. This mansion, with its towering walls and cold, immaculate rooms, felt less like an escape and more like a gilded cage. The wealth that surrounded him, once an enticing promise of freedom, now felt like an inescapable prison built on a foundation of manipulation and control. Sylvia had made it clear from the moment he accepted her proposal that this marriage was not about love, not about companionship, but about power. She had offered him security, freedom from his debts, financial stability for his family in exchange for his name, his presence beside her. But in the days that followed, Ethan began to feel the coldness of that exchange. He was no longer just a man with debts to pay off. He was now a piece in Sylvia's carefully constructed game, a tool used to further her own agenda. In the beginning, it all seemed simple enough. Sylvia had promised to clear his debts, to secure his family's future. And while the prospect of freedom from the suffocating grip of financial ruin was appealing, the reality of living in Sylvia's world became an unsettling experience. Every room in the mansion felt cold and empty, no matter how luxuriously appointed. It was as though the walls themselves were designed to keep people at a distance, to prevent any sense of real connection or warmth. The mansion was a place of opulence, but it lacked the one thing that had always meant the most to Ethan: human connection. He spent his days wandering the vast estate, trying to adjust to the silence, to the strange sense of isolation that seemed to pervade every corner of his new life. Sylvia was always present, but she was distant. Her presence was commanding, almost overwhelming, yet there was no warmth in her gaze, no sense of companionship. She was a woman who had lived a life of control and precision, and now she had decided to control him as well. He was not her partner, her equal. He was her possession, a means to an end. Ethan had never imagined that his life would come to this, married to a woman who didn't care for him, who saw him only as a business arrangement, a stepping stone in her quest for control over her own legacy. Yet he couldn't escape the fact that he had willingly entered this agreement. His desperation, his need to save his family, had pushed him to make this choice. The weight of that decision now hung heavily on his shoulders like an invisible chain that kept him tethered to a life he had never imagined for himself. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's feelings of isolation only deepened. The house, though vast and luxurious, felt smaller and smaller with each passing day. The staff moved silently around him, their eyes downcast, avoiding his gaze. He was treated as an outsider in a world that was not his own, a world where he didn't belong. The cold indifference that Sylvia exuded only made him feel more alienated. She had made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't interested in a traditional marriage. She wasn't interested in affection, in love, or in any form of emotional connection. To her, this was a business deal, nothing more. And yet, as he navigated his new life, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play, something darker beneath the surface of their arrangement. Sylvia's insistence on maintaining control, her icy demeanor, began to feel like a facade, one that hid something far more complex. He had come to her for a solution to his problems, to escape the crushing weight of his father's debts. But what he found instead was a woman consumed by a need for vengeance, a woman whose motivations went far beyond what she had revealed. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself wandering the hallways of the mansion once again. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the silence, the isolation, was beginning to drive him to the brink. As he passed one of the many locked doors in the house, he felt an inexplicable pull, a curiosity, a need to understand what lay behind it. The door had been locked since he arrived, and Sylvia had never spoken of it. He knew he shouldn't pry, that it wasn't his place to search for answers, but something inside him urged him to open it, to uncover what Sylvia was hiding. With trembling hands, he reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and the room beyond was like something frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture, and the air felt thick with the weight of years of neglect. Photographs lined a table in the center of the room. Old faded pictures of Sylvia's past, of her late husband, Harold, and of another man Ethan didn't recognize. There was an undeniable sense of sadness in the room, as if it held the memories of lives long gone, of things better left forgotten. But it was the papers on the desk that caught his attention. Legal documents, old letters, and business contracts, all detailing the financial collapse of Sylvia's family, all pointing to the same person, Ethan's father. He began to read through them, his heart sinking with each word. The documents outlined the deceit, the fraud, and the betrayal that had led to the fall of Sylvia's fortune. The accusations were damning, and Ethan could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. His father had played a part in this. His actions, his lies, had led to the ruin of a woman's family. And now it seemed that Sylvia was determined to make his family pay for it. But it was the last document that stopped him cold. A marriage license bearing both his and Sylvia's names dated weeks before their official wedding. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. Sylvia had planned this all along. She had married him not for any business arrangement, not for any mutual benefit, but as part of a larger scheme of revenge. She had used him, manipulated him, and now he was a pawn in her game. A game that had been set in motion long before they ever met. The truth was unbearable. Sylvia had lured him into this marriage, promising him freedom, security, and a way out of his debts, only to trap him in a cycle of manipulation and vengeance. He had thought he was saving his family, but in reality, he had been playing right into her hands. His father's sins had now become his own, and he was left to pick up the pieces of a past he never wanted to inherit. Ethan stood in that dusty, forgotten room, the weight of the documents in his hands. He had made the decision to marry Sylvia, for a chance at a better life. But now he realized that in doing so, he had unknowingly become entangled in a web of deceit and revenge. The security he had sought was an illusion, and the price of his decision was far greater than he could have ever imagined. As the walls of the mansion closed in around him, Ethan was left to grapple with the harsh reality that his past had caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. Ethan Carter's world was unraveling in ways he never could have imagined when he first accepted Sylvia Weston's proposition. What had seemed like a simple, albeit unusual arrangement, a marriage built on mutual benefit, had quickly turned into a suffocating nightmare of secrets and lies. The mansion, once a symbol of escape from his debts, had transformed into a gilded cage. The luxury he had hoped would offer comfort only served to amplify the isolation he felt within its walls. Each day spent in the company of Sylvia and her carefully curated life left Ethan feeling more disconnected, more like an outsider in a world that wasn't his own. The walls of Sylvia's mansion were not just physical barriers. They had become a metaphor for the emotional distance that existed between them. Sylvia, though present in the same space, was always unreachable. Her demeanor was cool, calculated, and controlled. She seemed to regard him as little more than a necessary accessory, a means to an end. The warmth and affection he had once hoped to find in their marriage were absent, replaced by a quiet, oppressive tension that filled every room. There were no conversations about dreams or hopes for the future. There were no moments of vulnerability or shared connection. There was only the sterile exchange of pleasantries, the hollow rituals of a marriage that existed for nothing more than appearances. As the days wore on, Ethan began to notice that the mansion wasn't the only thing that felt like it was closing in on him. The staff, who had once been a faceless presence, now seemed to move around him with an air of subtle avoidance, as though they knew something he didn't. The house itself, though large and grand, felt like a prison. Every corridor, every locked door, every carefully curated detail seemed to whisper of secrets that were meant to remain hidden. Ethan had never felt so small, so powerless in his entire life. His decision to marry Sylvia had seemed like the only way to secure his family's future, but now it seemed as though he had traded one set of chains for another. The debts that had once defined his life had been replaced by a new burden, one of control, manipulation, and the weight of knowing he had become part of a much darker plan than he had ever anticipated. Ethan's feelings of isolation deepened, as he realized that his presence in the mansion was not as significant as he had once hoped. Sylvia had made it clear from the beginning that he wasn't there for love, for companionship, or even for mutual respect. He was there to fulfill a role, to help her solidify her legacy and her control over the empire she had built. His personal desires, his struggles, his needs, they didn't matter. He was a tool, a means to an end. The more he reflected on this, the more he realized how deeply he had underestimated the gravity of his decision. He had hoped that marriage, even in its most transactional form, would offer him a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. But instead, it had only made him feel more invisible, more lost in a world that wasn't his own. What stung the most was that Sylvia's coldness, her calculated indifference, seemed to be more than just a personal failing. It was part of a much larger, much more deliberate strategy. Ethan wasn't just a pawn in her game, he was an integral piece in a long-standing vendetta. He had married into a legacy of pain, of betrayal, and of revenge. It had been weeks since their wedding, and Sylvia had shown no sign of softening. There had been no moments of tenderness, no gestures that made him feel like he was more than just a contract. In the quiet of the mansion, Ethan found himself consumed by the weight of his thoughts. The nights were the hardest. He would lie in bed, staring up at the ornate ceiling, the echoes of his own heartbeat the only sound in the stillness. The past, the debts, his father's legacy, his mother's illness, had followed him here. But now there was something else, something even more oppressive. The realization that Sylvia had used him to fulfill her own plans of revenge was a constant weight on his chest. He had become a pawn in her game, and what's worse, he had willingly stepped into it. But it wasn't just Sylvia's motivations that left him feeling suffocated. It was the way the mansion itself seemed to reflect the emptiness of their union. The house, despite its beauty and grandeur, felt as cold and lifeless as Sylvia's heart. Each room, each hallway seemed to mock him, reminding him that he was trapped in a world he didn't belong to. The silence that stretched between him and Sylvia was deafening. There were no conversations that mattered. There was no attempt to get to know one another, to build something meaningful. There was only an unspoken understanding that they were bound together by something far darker than any shared affection or mutual respect could ever be. It was during one of these long solitary nights that Ethan's curiosity led him to the hidden room in the mansion, a place he had been told to avoid, a place that Sylvia never mentioned. His sense of unease had grown stronger, and the pull of the unknown was too strong to resist. What he discovered in that room only served to deepen the sense of betrayal that had begun to fester inside him. The old photographs, the legal documents, the marriage license, each one revealed a truth he had never suspected. Sylvia's marriage to him had never been about building a life together. It had never been about love or companionship. It had been about settling old scores, exacting revenge on the family that had wronged her. The documents told the story of Ethan's father, a man whose business dealings had played a key role in the financial ruin of Sylvia's family. As he read the words on the page, Ethan felt a sickening sense of realization settle in his stomach. His father's legacy had been one of deceit and betrayal, and now Sylvia was using him, using their marriage as a way to exact that same vengeance on his family. The very thing he had hoped to escape from had now become the very thing he was trapped in. His father's mistakes had become his own, and there was no way to undo it. Ethan stood there in that forgotten room, his mind racing with a million thoughts. His entire life had been shaped by his desire to escape the burden of his father's mistakes, but now he had unwittingly become a part of that very legacy. Sylvia had used him, manipulated him, and now he was nothing more than a pawn in her scheme. The weight of this realization was crushing. He had hoped that by marrying Sylvia he could create a better life for himself and his family. But instead he had become entangled in a web of deceit, revenge, and manipulation. A web from which he could see no way out. In that moment, standing in the silence of the hidden room, Ethan realized that his life would never be the same. He had made a choice, one that he had thought would lead him to freedom, but it had instead led him into the heart of a much darker game. The truth of his situation was clear now. He was trapped. And the more he tried to understand his place in this world, the more he realized that the life he had dreamed of was slipping away piece by piece. Sylvia had won. And in her victory, he had lost everything. Ethan Carter's journey is a powerful reminder of the complexities of life, where choices, no matter how well-intentioned, can lead us down paths we never expected. His story teaches us that even the most desperate of circumstances can lead to decisions that ultimately change the course of our lives in profound ways. What began as a seemingly pragmatic solution to his family's financial burdens turned into a web of manipulation and betrayal, highlighting the dangers of acting without fully understanding the consequences. Sylvia Weston, a woman consumed by revenge, used Ethan's vulnerability and sense of obligation to trap him in a cycle of control. But in his moment of realization, when the truth surfaced and the weight of his choices crushed him, Ethan discovered a valuable lesson. Freedom doesn't come from wealth or security. It comes from understanding our own worth and the integrity of our decisions. The story also emphasized the importance of self-awareness and the courage to face the uncomfortable truths about our circumstances. It's a stark reminder that while we may feel pressured by external forces, be it family expectations or financial hardship, it's critical to stay true to ourselves and make decisions that align with our values, not just our immediate needs. Ethan's internal struggle and his eventual realization that he had traded one prison for another serves as a cautionary tale. True freedom can only be found when we break free from the things that seek to control us, even if those things come disguised as opportunities. If Ethan's journey has inspired you, or if you found value in his story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support fuels the creation of more heartfelt stories that remind us of the power of resilience, self-reflection, and making the right choices in a world full of challenges. Stay tuned for the next story. Together we can explore more lessons that inspire us to live better lives. Thank you for joining us.